And during that time, Zelensky actually used that as an opportunity to sort of clip farm.
You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards.
Trump said, hey, I only allowed this to go this far because I want the people to see Zelensky's true colors, and this man does not want peace.
Right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing cards.
But why are Russia and the United States enemies today, and why are we even aligned with Ukraine at all? Why do we care about something that's going on halfway across the world?
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III.
The phrase that was used, it's a famous phrase, was not 1 inch eastward. So NATO is here. NATO is in the West. We're going to stay there. We're not going to keep expanding. Well, we pretty much started breaking that immediately. He was propped up by the Western governments specifically because he was friendly towards the West.
So you get the picture of him with having the beer with the soldiers, and you get to put on Reddit, and there's like a Marvel kind of caption. You know, the next Marvel movie will be about Zelensky and like he's good, Putin's evil.
Yeah,
exactly.
From the beginning, he has been a warmonger. He has been unreasonable. He has been completely steel-headed. He's not going anywhere. If you want Putin out, you need to conquer Russia and do it yourself. And Zelensky knows that.
Yeah, so this week, Trump and Zelensky, they met up and they had a discussion, and J.D. Vance was there as well. And this was in the White House, and they met up, and the goal was to negotiate a situation where the outcome of peace would be attained, and how would they attain that regarding the conflict in Ukraine and Russia currently, right? And so, you know, what we saw as a public, we didn't see the backroom discussion. We only saw what happened on, in the media and during the kind of the interview phase where the media was asking questions to Trump and J.D. Vance and Zelensky himself. And during that time, Zelensky actually used that as an opportunity to sort of clip farm for his agenda. And if you're unfamiliar with that term, what that means is hey, let me go on somebody else's bigger platform and try to make a viral clip to where people are literally going to make this clip go viral and say, hey, I can't believe this happened. Let's talk about this and this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
And it worked obviously because it is a viral clip, but I don't think it worked in his favor, and we'll get into that and get into why. But first, let me kind of explain what actually transpired. So J.D. Vance was asked a question about, hey, how are the negotiations going? Like, what's going on with the negotiations? Like, how are we going to get to peace? And he was interrupted by Zelensky when he was explaining certain things about what was going on with the negotiations. And Zelensky said something to the effect of, hey, here's the history of the situation. Russians invaded our country in 2014, and you're not talking about that and this, that, and the other. And we're going to dive into the history a little bit later here, but just for right now, just kind of for the context of this, some of that is, well, all of what he said was from his perspective and from the Ukrainian perspective of what happened. And he's missing the other half of the picture, right? So he gave that, and this was on national television for United States media. So this was seen as a rude interruption or a rude kind of clip farming attempt in Trump and J.D. Vance's domain, in their house, literally. And again, this is something that if we went to, let's say we had an interview in Russia or in Ukraine or in China. If we interrupted them to give our little variant or our version of the historical events of what transpired in, let's say, the Tiananmen Square or what have you, we're not going to be allowed to. That's not going to be aired. We're not going to be allowed to talk about that. We'll be punished for that, right? Mm-hmm. But he was rewarded by certain people and what have you for doing this. Anyway, to kind of get to the end of this, he did some clip farming and he did kind of push back and stuff. Trump allowed it to occur. Trump said, hey, let me just kind of let J.D. Vance handle this for a few minutes to see what's going on. But at the end of the conversation, Trump said, hey, I only allowed this to go this far because I want the people to see Zelensky's true colors, and this man does not want peace, okay? And after the clip went viral, Trump tweeted, or maybe truthed, basically a long statement saying, I have come to the determination that Zelensky does not want peace at this time. And so we need to kind of readdress the situation moving forward and how we analyze it and how we handle it. So Trump got a little bit upset about how he was behaving in that situation, rightfully so, because it was a bit rude. And 72 hours later, we can discuss what happened, but that's basically the nutshell of what happened on the clip. Yeah. So kicking it back over to you, I think if you want to give some of a broader context of kind of what's really going on in the Russia-Ukraine kind of conflict, I would like you to kind of give a top-down example of that, or an explanation of what was going on. So
sure. So that was a great, in a nutshell, explanation. And just to quickly add on to that, I just felt like The Americans, as everybody watching this is most likely American, Trump and JD Vance, like you said, they viewed this as a very disrespectful thing to do. And the conclusion they drew from that, of course, is that Zelensky does not really care about peace, right? And I happen to agree with that. And to help understand why, I'm just going to quickly give an explanation of how did we get to this point. So I'm not just talking about how the war started, but why are Russia and the United States so like enemies today, and why are we even aligned with Ukraine at all? Why do we care about something that's going on halfway across the world? We have no real security interests in Ukraine. It doesn't matter whether Ukraine is controlled by Russia or the Ukrainians. It really does not affect us at all. So why do we care at all? Well, you kind of have to go back to the end of the Cold War. Okay, so back in the 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed, and before the Soviet Union collapsed, there was Russia, and then a bunch of surrounding states they call the Balkans, right? And these little states in between, and that included Ukraine, it included like Poland, Hungary, countries like this served as like a buffer zone between the West, so Europe and the United States, and the Russian homeland, right? So Russia felt very secure in this setup because if you want to, let's say, attack Moscow, there's a ton of land and a ton of little small countries you'd have to go through first to even get there. So this was a very secure situation. Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed, all of these little countries in between Russia and the West suddenly were on their own, okay? And they may or may not have wanted to align with Russia. A lot of them were not very happy with Russia. So now these are like the states that have animosity towards them. And so in part of the agreements to like respect the new Russian government after the fall of the Soviet Union was the West promised, like, hey, we have this thing called NATO, which already existed. It was formed back in the 40s. And this is a defensive alliance that the United States and a bunch of European countries have set up. So what we'll do is, in order to help you set up your country and be more democratic and be more like the Western countries, we'll promise not to threaten your security. In the meantime, we're going to give you peace. We're going to give you space to develop. You won't have to worry about us. And we won't expand NATO eastward. So the phrase that was used, it's a famous phrase, was not 1 inch eastward. So NATO is here. NATO is in the West. We're going to stay there. We're not going to keep expanding. Well, we pretty much started breaking that immediately, right? And by we, I mean the United States and the rest of NATO. NATO started expanding eastward basically right away. We started gobbling up Poland, Hungary, other Baltic states. We gobbled up into NATO, and you see how the border is pushing closer and closer to Russia. And at every stage of the way here, Russia specifically said, stop, don't do that. Like, we see this, we see what you're doing, and it doesn't matter what you say you're doing. What we see it as is a provocation. We see you inching closer and closer to our borders, and it makes us feel insecure. Now, back then, Russia was still recovering from the fall of the Soviet Union. They weren't really strong enough to do anything about it. Otherwise, we may have seen this war happen in the 90s if Russia was capable of it, but they weren't. That's not the case today. So to fast forward a little bit, and I'll try to wrap this up, but I think it's a useful history lesson, is in 2014, I'll go to 2014. So in 2014, basically Russia and Ukraine were friendly, okay? The Russian president at the time was pro-Russian. The Ukrainian president at the time was pro-Russian. So they had a pretty good relationship, and they were neutral. So they were not members of NATO, but they also were not necessarily allied with Russia, but they were friendly. They were on good terms, which is what you want in a border state situation. They were friendly. Well, that president lost the election. In fact, he was pushed out. Let's be honest with you. He was forced out. Who took over was a gentleman named Vladimir Zelensky. Important correction I have to make here. The president that I'm speaking about in this clip is Viktor Yanukovych. He was forced to flee Ukraine in 2014 after the Euromaidan protests. It was April of that year, March and April of that year, that Russia began their military escalations in the Donbass region. And then a election was held in May of 2014 where somebody named Petro Poroshenko was actually elected, not Zelensky. Zelensky did not get elected until 2019. However, Petro Poroshenko was also a pro-Western president. He escalated the alliance with the European Union and began the process of joining the European Union, which is obviously adjacent to NATO. So my overall point stands, but I wanted to get those details right, and I'm the one editing this, so I decided to put this in. Okay. Now, Zelensky was elected, okay, on a platform of anti-Russia, pro-NATO. Okay, so he was propped up by the Western governments specifically because he was friendly towards the West. So immediately, Russia responded. And what did they do? They started bolstering, and by bolstering, I mean providing arms and military support to insurgent groups, terrorist groups in what's called the Donbass region. So this is the region right on the border between Ukraine and Russia, a very Russian region ethnically. They speak a lot of Russian there. There's a lot of sentiment in this area, although it's arguable how much, but there's a lot of sentiment in this area of like pro-Russia and we don't want to be part of Ukraine. So Russia basically stoked that in order to start a conflict. And they wanted to start a conflict to make sure that Ukraine was not an attractive option to NATO. NATO doesn't want a country that's unstable. They don't want to enter a war. At least this is what Putin thought, right? So he destabilized the country. Since 2014, there's been skirmishes, there's been wars, there's been fighting, and they've tried many times. Both sides have tried to set up peace talks and so-called ceasefires. Every single one of them has failed. Both sides blame the other one for those. But fast forward to now 2022. Actually, maybe was it 2021 when the invasion started?
2021.
Yeah.
2021.
NATO and Ukraine are just getting too close for comfort. So Putin does what he did. He amassed an army at the border and invaded. And so now we have a full-scale war.
That I do want to ask myself and you to Steelman sort of, because I want to give some charitability to Zelensky. I'm going to try to. I do believe he's a sociopath in some respects, or maybe a psychopath. But I'm going to try to pretend that I don't believe that, just for the sake of not being biased.
Yeah.
I think let's assume that Zelensky is this kind of Braveheart type figure that Lex Friedman calls him, and like all these people say he's having a beer with all of his army guys, like he's having a beer with all of his soldiers, like he's just in there. He stayed in his capital while he was being invaded, even though he was being told not to.
Right.
So you get the picture of him with having the beer with the soldiers, and you get to put on Reddit, and there's like a Marvel kind of caption. The next Marvel movie will be about Zelensky and like he's good, Putin's evil.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so let me put myself in the shoes of somebody like who thinks that, and think, how would I have handled this differently, right? You're still in a tough spot, right? Let's say you're Braveheart Zelensky, and you're in the White House right now, begging for more money or begging for more missiles or whatever. I don't know why you're there, begging for you're there because you have to be there. If your goal is truly to be that Braveheart Zelensky and take back all the land that has already been taken back from you, and end this war in the best way for yourself, you have to remember there's a part of you that's trying to think, okay, I'm not in full control of my guys here. And why I say that is because when Trump pushed back on him, and when Trump said, hey, you're trying to start World War III over this, what are you doing? Let's at least get a ceasefire. And Zelensky kind of said, and he kind of said it quietly, but he said, my guys won't listen to a ceasefire. They're not going to implement a ceasefire. What that tells me is that your guys don't follow your orders, so you're not the head guy in charge. So even in this little situation, you can't even control. Exactly. So that makes me think that he fears, he fears his soldiers, he fears his guys.
Right.
So how are you going to get out of the situation untethered, right, unscathed? So I guess that's the angle where I'm thinking, okay, if you're that Braveheart figure, then yeah, you got to go up on TV and say, hey, let me clip farm, let me raise awareness, and let me attempt to. Otherwise, I can only assume and believe that he was coached by some kind of liberal or military industrial complex type lobbyist to say, hey, try to go gather as much sentiment or manufacture as much consent for this war to keep going.
Yeah.
And here's how you're going to do it. So I think he was coached into doing that. So I do want to answer your question on why the war is happening. But before I do that, I want to kick it back over to you if you have a brief analysis or brief kind of other perspective on kind of what I just asked.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. I'll unsteelman Zelensky a little bit here, right? I'm just going to use the strongest possible terms. Okay. I think Zelensky is a demon. Okay. I think Zelensky is a creature who only cares about war and destruction. right? I think that from the beginning, he has been a warmonger. He has been unreasonable. He has been completely steel-headed. I mean, he is committed to sending every last Ukrainian man to die on the front lines of this battlefield. Why? Because that's why he's in power. He got elected on this platform of anti-Russia. If there's no conflict with Russia, there's no point to have Zelensky, and he knows that. There's no other reason to have Zelensky in power except for the fact that he hates Russia. And for anybody listening, I'll never recommend Lex Friedman to anybody, but he did do one of the few long form Western interviews with Zelensky, and I think it's worth listening to simply because you can hear in Zelensky's own words how impossible he is to deal with. Every time Lex tries to bring up yeah, okay, I get it, you have your grievances, but listen, people are dying. This war's gone on too long. Shouldn't there be some attempt to find peace? Every time Lex brings that up, Zelensky responds with, we can't respond. We can't have peace with Russia. Russians are animals. They're all monsters. He says this about Putin. Putin is a demon. Putin only wants war. He can't be talked to. He can't be reasoned with. Ukraine will never be safe until Putin is dead or out of power. These are insane words. And by the way, another thing Zelensky has done from the beginning of this war is basically say he will not negotiate peace with Russia until Putin is out of office, which is ridiculous. That will never happen, and he knows it. He knows that Putin isn't going anywhere. He's well liked in Russia. He's a powerful leader. He's very strong, and the Russian people like him. He has a strong staff who all seem to respect him. He's not going anywhere. If you want Putin out, you need to conquer Russia and do it yourself. And Zelensky knows that. So by saying I'm only going to negotiate if Putin's out, that's the same thing as saying I'm refusing to negotiate. I just want war forever, just forever, because that outcome is impossible. What's up, guys? Thanks for checking out this clip from the Maneuver Life podcast. If you enjoyed it, consider liking and subscribing and leaving a comment, even if it's just because you want to tell us how dumb you think we are, but especially if you want to tell us how much you agree with what we were saying. We have weekly uploads every single Monday, long-form conversations just like this one. So consider checking it out one way or the other. Thank you so much for your attention. You have a good rest of your day.